So my talk is, I'm going to take 3 slices in time, the past, the present, and what might be the future, and just dip into those as a way of thinking about where design and design research have come from and where it might be going. Oh, and I'm listed as an academic, and that is true. That's what I do now most of the time. But I actually spent the first 30 years as a practitioner in industry doing front-end design research, and I'm still working as a practitioner. But I was also teaching part-time the whole time, so I'm really both. And I think on the examples that I'll show you, some of them come from practice, some of them come from projects at the university, and some of them, I believe, come from student courses as well. So it's a little mixture of all of that. I start with an inspirational quote that I think might give you an idea of where my head is at. And this is from Ivan Illich, from Tools for Conviviality, who said in the early 70s that people need not only to obtain things, but they need above all the freedom to make things among which they can live, to give shape to them according to their own tastes, and to put them to use in caring for and about others. And so my approach is very much about the needs and the dreams of people. I came to design with degrees in psychology and anthropology, and I've worked in design with designers and others for all of those years, but you still see the sort of the psychological, anthropological component. So the 3 slices are 84, today, and 2044, roughly 30 years between. And the pattern that I'll talk about is this move from designing to co-designing, and then possibly a move toward what I'll call and try to describe for you as collective dreaming. Now, collective dreaming, it's not a prediction, it is an aspiration. So I can't predict the future, but I could tell you what I wish. And I think, too, you'll see that the difference here is huge. And so the difference between those two, I think, will be even bigger. So 1984, how many people were in the workforce in 1984? Good. Sometimes there's only one. And me. In 1984, I'd been at a design firm for a few years, so I kind of knew what was going on in practice. Now, keep in mind, in 1984, the Apple Macintosh had just been introduced. We had our first cellular phones. I believe we saw a picture of one this morning, the Brick. The first commercial CD players were introduced. The first laser jet printer was just introduced. Neuromancer was published then, and that's impacted many fields since then. The first Ghostbusters was a big hit. And TED, the technology, technology, entertainment, and design had just come on board. And how we worked, we had phones, we had face-to-face, and if the budget was big enough, we had FedEx, overnight mail. I mean, you only did that when you were desperate. We didn't carry cell phones, we didn't have laptops. The internet existed, but it wasn't something that people used in their daily lives. And teamwork wasn't really common. It was more, you do your thing and you give it to the other group. So that's how we worked in 1984. Like I said, I've always worked in design with designers. And at that time, designers did not explore what to design. They explored how to design what the client wanted them to design. So design would start with the RFP, the request for proposal, and where the client would say, well, this is what we want. We've already determined that. Innovation then was in the hands of the client, and sometimes it was technology driven, like we have this new technology, what are we going to do with it? And sometimes it was market driven, like let's make another one with more buttons that's cheaper, and we'll sell it to more people. And so in 1984, design was all about giving shape to the future. So this is how I see the whole design process, where the red dot indicates the point at which you know what you're designing. Okay, so in 1984, we just had this side of it. And this would be the RFP. The client would say, hey, we want you to design this. And there was an iterative process of giving shape to the future, designing the product. We didn't really talk about services then. The space, the communication materials. This whole front end then has grown since 1984. But even in 1984, the client would come with the RFP. The designers would go, wait, but why do you want to do that? Can't we just back up a little? Can't we just explore? So that the front end was already kind of growing some tentacles at that time. So that was 1984, roughly 30 years ago. Today, what we have are interdisciplinary teams that are responsible for design at many different levels of scale and many different facets. And designers and design researchers are being called upon to explore what to design, not just how to design it. And that is a far more complicated task. And in fact, today we find that designers are learning the skills to be the facilitators of the collective creativity of other people. Okay, and that may be other designers, other internal groups of people co-creating together, but more often than not, it's starting to be co-creating with people without any training in design whatsoever. And designers and design researchers are now learning how to make sure that what is designed makes sense in the future. And so the activity has, a lot of activity has moved into what I call the fuzzy front end, or the period in the design process where you're exploring and learning and sometimes wandering around aimlessly trying to figure out what makes sense and what should be designed. Not what can be designed that we can sell and make money, but what do people actually need in their lives. Now, that's not to say that this part is unimportant. Obviously, you need both parts of this process, and we need designers and design researchers that are skilled on both sides, but we certainly, the key then is making sure that there's not a gap between the making sense of the future and the giving shape to the future. And so now we see this co-designing, bringing other people into, particularly into the front end of the process. Sometimes the co-designing is being done by designers, co-designing together. Sometimes it's bringing other or internal stakeholders into the design process. And more we're seeing external stakeholders also being brought into that process, not just as respondents or subjects, but as participants in the process. So depending on, like what industry you're in and what names you call these people, it might be the producers and the consumers, or the end users. The patients, families, and healthcare providers are being brought into the process in the front end. Community members, shoppers and sellers, for example. So the co-design is being practiced across many different kinds of stakeholder groups. The co-designing can happen at any part of the process. Okay, you can do co-designing at this end as well. Most of my examples are earlier in the front end, and I'll show you a lot of examples there. But just the co-designing is an approach. It isn't a method per se. There's many methods of co-designing, but that attitude could take place in the front, in the middle, at the end, or all the way through the process. And the model or framework that I use to talk about co-designing, but also to plan co-designing activities or projects. It's a very simple framework. And it calls for engaging these stakeholders, whether they're internal or external, in an iterative loop of making, telling, and enacting, or enacting, making, and telling, or telling, enacting. So you can start with any category of activity, and you can move in any direction around this, but over the course of a project or an event, ideally, you would engage the people in all of those kinds of activities so that possibly they make something. Maybe it's a three-dimensional thing they make, and then they enact or they pretend. They play future scenarios with it to imagine and unlock their ideas of how their future would change if they had this magical device. Or you might start by telling stories and then building things so the stories can be enacted. So I have a lot of different examples, not as many as I usually do, because I'm trying to keep it to half an hour so there's time for questions. But I feel really fortunate to have more than 2 minutes. That'd be really, really hard. So this is an image collage toolkit. Okay, so it's all of the items have been chosen very deliberately. We have pictures, shapes, words, and phrases for people to, in this case, collectively create a vision for the future. So you see here, you can see sort of the number of items and the scale of the items, because here we're working with a group of people. And they've have the opportunity then to collectively create a vision for the future of their organization. So you see the images are large. There's a lot of variety. This image is great. You can see that it has a round table, which makes it easy for everybody at the table to reach everything equally. So everybody is at one level and can contribute. Okay, so the images are very carefully selected. I'm not going to talk about that, but if there's questions, I'll be happy to talk about how do you figure out what's in the toolkit. After the team has created the vision, somebody tells the story behind it. Somebody presents what they decided, because it might have, in this case, this is a vision of a future hospital. So it's at the beginning of an architectural hospital design. The hospital will be moved into 8 years from this date, because that's how long it takes to design the hospital, build it, and do the transition planning to move in. And so the team has been invited to create a collective vision of the patient family experience 8 years in the future, not the healthcare staff workers' experience, okay, but the patient family. So the people doing the creating are the ones who will be responsible for getting this new hospital built, which would be different members of the architectural team and representatives in the hospital of all the various groups. So obviously, the things in the middle of the bullseye are the most important. These things become progressively less important. So it takes a long time for a group to make all these decisions. And then in the presentation, we find out what it means. For example, there's a golden retriever in the middle. And we learn what that, it doesn't mean we want golden retrievers in the hospital. It has a lot to do with sort of the metaphorical aspect of the character of that dog. So the telling is critical. This is an ecosystem mapping made by 2 ordinary citizens in the UK. In their community, they were having trouble with wastewater practices, like flushing stuff down the toilet that you shouldn't flush down the toilet. And so they're bringing citizens together to rethink these. And I was really quite impressed with how groups of people from the community, volunteers, came together. They didn't know each other, but went through a series of activities and were able then to create an ecosystem mapping that made sense. Here what we're doing is using the idea of a persona as a co-design method. Okay, so this is not a persona that we're going to use as sort of a design tool. In this case, it's the participant has been asked to make a persona poster about this person in the future. Okay, so it's a way of unlocking sort of, you see the fears and the dreams of this individual for the future through a poster. Okay, so when we're working with individuals, we would have a number of these posters created and presented. I've done a lot of work in healthcare, and I spent 6 years before I went to the university. I spent 6 years inside an architectural firm, which gave us the opportunity to try different, to take the tools and the methods which I had used primarily in more consumer and industrial projects and apply them to healthcare design. So this is a toolkit. Now you see the number of items in the toolkit. There's a large number of items, but it's definitely limited. I'm saying this for you workshop people, because you're going to be exposed to like a massive amount of stimuli that you're going to have to put into a toolkit very quickly and then apply on another group of people and vice versa. So the selection of the toolkit is an important thing to learn how to do. In this case, the toolkit was to give people who had spent a lot of time in the heart hospital an opportunity to rethink the patient room from a heart hospital's perspective, because this hospital was building a new wing for heart patients. So you can see here the toolkit was a combination of sort of a floor plan to scale, pieces of furniture, but a whole lot of emotional and amenity-like options that they could choose from as well. And so you see here a couple of former patients working. In this case, we would have maybe 4 or 5 teams working together at the same time. Each team would come up with their ideal patient room, and then they would all present to each other. And then we would give them a number of heart stickers of different sizes so that they could vote on all the best ideas in the room that day. And they could vote for their own ideas, or they could vote for other people's ideas. And so this concept got a lot of votes from other teams. And one thing that surprised me on projects like this is I went into this in the architectural firm thinking that the designers would be pleased and overwhelmed with all of the rich ideas that the heart patients would provide. But what I found instead was what they appreciated was our ability to have them prioritize their own good ideas. Because the designers had all the ideas. They had no idea which ideas were relevant in terms of making sense of the future. They didn't know. And so the big idea that came out of this project, I remember, was a heavenly bed right next to the bathroom. The single most important idea in a hospital room if you're a heart patient. Heavenly having to do with the quality of the sheets and the pillows right next to the bathroom. Which makes sense, but it isn't something an architect would ever come up with as the top idea. This is a 3-dimensional toolkit. I call it Velcro modeling. And so there's a bunch of, this is the glamour shot before it gets all messed up. But these are all covered in Velcro. There's hundreds of pieces, and these all have Velcro on them so that people can very quickly mock up things, devices, like really quickly, much faster than Legos, because it's much cruder. And so in this particular case, we've been meeting with this lady in her home we've been there for almost 2 hours talking about her home experience, the past, the current home experience, the past home experience, her dreams for the future. And the final exercise is for her to make something out of all these parts and pieces that could help her live her life according to her dream in the future. And you can see, I love this because you can see how proud she is. Like, it doesn't look like much because that's all she got to work with, but she will then explain what it does for her and how it makes her feel, and her ability to just create that very, very quick. It's like a dream catcher, but because it's physical, there's something really magical about it. And I've seen people create like 3 of those within a 5-10 minute span. So if people have been dreaming about future experience and then they're confronted with all the Velcro parts, they can very quickly get their ideas in 3-dimensional form, and then when they're asked to share it or tell a story about it, they go on and on. And some of them automatically start enacting with it because it's the right size, and they just start telling stories. In the architectural firm, we explored small-scale 3-dimensional toolkits so that people such as nurses could collaboratively create ideal hospital spaces. And so here we do have the constraints of the size of the room. The walls are plexiglass so that they can see. So what's interesting here, these 3 women work at the same hospital in different units, so they don't know each other. They've come on their lunch hour to the workshop. The first thing they do is they share the things they hate about the rooms that they work in. So it's like a bitch session. It goes 10 minutes, and then it's like, okay, done. And then we let them make the ideal room. Now you notice behind here there's hundreds of pieces, and you'll notice that the pieces are a combination of very concrete. There's a lamp and a chair and a toilet, but a lot of the pieces are ambiguous, deliberately ambiguous, so that they can turn them into whatever they feel like turning them into. So this is the 3 women who didn't know each other collaboratively constructed this in 10 minutes, which is a lot of it. You can imagine how long it would take to do the observational and interview data to get to that point. Now they cheated, unfortunately. You notice they built the bathroom. Said you have to stay within these walls, but while I was watching another group, they slipped a bathroom. And it was too late to have them rethink it. But again, it's like it's data. It's saying the room's not big enough to be an ideal room if you have to put the bathroom in it there. Again, different. Here we've got blocks, dolls, and Velcro all thrown together as another way of mapping out spaces. So the toolkit, it can be very specific for hospital type things, but it can also be incredibly sort of put together out of parts and pieces that with the scale that works together. So I talked about the making, the telling, and the enacting. I've used puppets frequently for enacting because I think that in many cultures, getting people to enact with their bodies or do improv on the spot kind of thing, it's very threatening for people. So puppets can be a good way of getting people to enact through another character. And in fact, puppets are pretty culturally dependent. So this is a workshop in Spain where everybody wanted to do the puppets. The puppet scenario, so first of all, they took the puppets, they came up with the idea of giving each puppet a persona and a personality, and they're all related in some way. Then this was with practitioners learning about the methods. Then they created these scenario cards, these healthcare situations, so that they would then pull out a situation and then they would act through their character. And so this was a really powerful exercise, and I don't know what it is about Spain, but I had to stop them. Because they would have just kept, it was fun, it was loud, they just kept going. I found in the US, it's sort of 50-50. I don't ever require people to use puppets. In the projects I do, they can have puppets or they can have Velcro. And it's usually 50-50. Make something out of Velcro for your future experience or tell the story through puppets. But puppets are best for more extroverted people. So here's an interesting, this is a graduate student project. So here we have graduate students, she's not, from different departments working with people in an independent living community. And they formed a team because the students had some initial lectures about gerontology or whatever. So the students came and the elderly people joined their team because they were going to be talking about mobility. And so the first they wanted, it was a co-design activity. So they kept the mobility broad, and you can see here the seniors being given the opportunity to play with the tools and the materials. These were grad students, so I just let them go, and they had like, I'm going like, oh my gosh, that's too much. You know what I mean? It was like they threw everything on the table and just said, go for it. And I was worried. But it was a learning experience, so I just sat back and let it happen. And it was great. Each of the seniors picked what they were comfortable with and were totally capable of working with the tools and the materials. So what happened was the first couple of weeks, it was exploring what aspect of mobility are we going to deal with. Is it like the mobility of getting from your apartment into your car and going to the grocery store kind of mobility? Or is it something in your kitchen so that you can get up in the cupboard safely and get stuff there? And what happened was right before spring break, they decided they would do an app. An app so that elderly people, as well as their children or their spouse or their friends, an app so that they could figure out what decisions to think through to decide where they wanted to spend the rest of their lives. And this wasn't which retirement community should I join. This was, should I go to a retirement community? Should I move in with one of my children? Should I stay at home and adapt the home? It was all of those possibilities. So somehow they went from mobility. So this need just kept surfacing. And then that's what they did. And I admit this is a really capable group of seniors, but they basically developed, co-designed with the seniors, the entire, the wireframes for this decision-making app. We've not been able to implement it. We didn't have any computer science people on it, but it was just amazing, their ability to do this together. All the content came from the seniors. Different project. This is, again, a graduate student project. Here we have two endocrinologists who specialize in working with young people with type 1 diabetes. This is another co-designed studio, and they're mapping out the process of the doctor's office visit. Meanwhile, on the other side of the room, we have 3 students with type 1 diabetes mapping out their version. Okay, the same materials, the same toolkit at 2 ends of the room, mapping out that visit. Then they present to each other. And then they had an opportunity to all work together on the ideal process. And a concept came out of it. We call it Diabetes Tinder for sensitive topics. So what it is, so the issue in the doctor's visits with young people, there's topics they need to talk about. Sex, drugs, alcohol, all, things that really need attention if you're living with type 1 diabetes, but nobody wants to bring it up. And so this just the patient comes in, waits for the doctor's appointment, and just sort of says, yeah, these are things I'm interested in talking about. Nobody has to bring them up. It's just swipe right, swipe left. If they swipe too many things, it sends them to information sources to get more information, or the endocrinologist covers it in the next meeting, kind of a thing. So this one's exciting. We've mocked it up, and we're testing it with one of the endocrinologists who's letting us into her office, and we're seeing how it works, and so forth. So that's exciting to have a concept from a class being implemented. The last slice is collective dreaming. Another way of thinking about these is, this is designing for people, and that's been the tradition that's moving toward designing with people. And following that trajectory, I see the next step with collective dreaming as being designing by the people that are served by design. And so here, obviously being in 2044, I don't have a bunch of examples, but some thoughts. So I think that in 2044, everybody will design. We'll see design as a collective activity. It'll be everybody designing together. We'll see technology as a tool to serve people. And I'm seeing that here today, which is really, really exciting. Technology to serve people, not just a means to produce products for profit, which certainly was the case in the 80s. And I'd like to see that frugal innovation would be better funded than technological innovation. Like, how can we make the most out of what we have, or even if we don't have much, how can we work with that? So that then brings up the question is, who's going to make the tools and the materials that all of these people can use to imagine and express their collective ideas for future experience? So if everybody is designing and it's all a collective experience and everybody's going to be making, telling, and enacting, well, who's going to be making all that stuff? And I think it's the designers today, not all designers today, but a subset of our designers today will be the facilitators and the shapers of the collective dreams of the people in 2044. And so it's not that it's with designing for, with, and by people, they're running in parallel. Okay, one does not go away, it's just other layers, and that our goal then is to figure out who should be working through each approach. Not everybody is right for co-designing or collective dreaming. And so looking out into the future, well, this is a map that I put out in 2006. So this is an old map, and it's just starting to show some blobs in terms of where design research was at the time, with making a distinction between expert-driven approaches and participatory approaches, and then approaches to design research that came from a research perspective versus from a design-led perspective. And so people kept saying, well, when are you going to update the map? And I said, well, okay, it's not the same map anymore. So here's the 2006 map, and it's at the core of the new space, or the new map. And each ring around it is like over time. Okay, so this is out in 2044. So as you go out, it gets farther out in time. The scope of what's being designed is bigger. The complexity of what we're dealing with is bigger. The ambiguity of what we're dealing with as designers, everything's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I started plotting the sort of the newish design approaches, service design, social design, transition design. And so I'm sort of clustering them in ways that made sense to me at the time. User interaction, definitely. These aren't that new. Transformation design, I think that's Carnegie Mellon's thing. Embodied interaction. And then on this side we have an older approach of design interventions, but then critical design and design fiction, which in my readings, it came more from the art world, but it's definitely now embedded in all of the futures thinking that's going on. And so collective dreaming is way, way, way out there, but I do see that there are three, I'm calling them intentional slices. So this connects well to the morning presentation about the intentional, design as intention. There seems to be this slice about improving the human condition or the products and the services. There seems to be another slice which is about engaging, maybe for entertainment, maybe for education, and there's definitely a big, big slice here where provoking. Things are being made to provoke people to think about the future and to anticipate future consequences in that way. And so I see that collective dreaming is a space where people tell future stories collaboratively, they visualize future environments collectively, and they enact future scenarios together with others. And so with collective dreaming, we'll find new ways to give shape to the future so the consequences of our decisions can be explored in advance. Okay, so I can see this happening in VR, AR, and mixed, in these alternative realities. That's why it's exciting to hear what all you're working on here. We can do these things out there pretty soon. Now, I'm not talking about a situation where designers and researchers are creating the future scenarios for others. I'm talking about creating these spaces where the people create the futures and play them out by enacting the future consequences of their decisions of what they've made. So that's a huge difference. The tools have to get a lot more sophisticated before that can happen, I think. And so this is about situations where everybody is able to collaboratively imagine, create, and then enact their own personal as well as collective futures. So we have the means to embody virtual environments. We can do it in real spaces. That gets big and expensive. Virtual spaces and mixed virtual, hybrid spaces that are virtual and physical. So I think it's only a matter of time before we can invite everyday people into this collective creation of future scenarios, environments, and systems for better living. I guess the question is then, are designers in particular, are they willing to invite the people in to this playground in order to shape their own futures? That's a big step. I think some designers think it's very, very exciting. Other designers find it very threatening. And so I ask, are we as designers, researchers, and futurists, are we ready to embrace the mindset that we would need in order to support and facilitate this kind of collective dreaming by the people? And that's it.